you can put the page number. Because sometimes you yourself, you're looking for an issue, you might not be able to find it. So you cross-reference. Right? And especially, he says in the next section, where he says, وَعَوْرَةُ الرَّجُلِ, the awrah of a man is such and such. There he details it, and to some extent. So we're going to follow the author's order, so he says, وَسَتْرُ الْعَوْرَةِ, right? The covering of one's nakedness. The basis of awrah, right, is it's ma yu'aru kashfuhu, right? Because the awrah is that which is unbecoming to disclose. It's that which is unbecoming to disclose, right? So, and here awrah religiously, or shar'an, refers to that which is not permitted to disclose in front of those unrelated. A point of caution, right, is that the ulama, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has commanded us to cover our awrah. And so if you look in Hashir ibn Abdin, for example, page 270, volume 1, page 270, he says, وَوُجُوبُهُ عَامٌ, its obligation is general. Right? Its obligation is am, general. Right? Meaning, its wajib is required to cover one's awrah, both in the prayer and outside the prayer. Right? Now you could say, well, yes, it's wajib to cover the awrah in front of strangers, those unrelated. So he says, وَلَوْ فِي الْخَلْوَةِ عَلَى الصَّحِيحِ, even when you are alone, عَلَى الصَّحِيحِ, right? And you can see that the awrah here, when alone, for both men and women, refer to between navel and knee, right? And this is often neglected, unless there's an excuse, right? Unless there's an excuse or a need, right? إِلَّا لِغَرَض, right? وَوُجُوبُهُ, and al-Tahtawi saves on ink, right? So he says, وُجُوبُهُ عَام, its obligation is general. وَلَوْ فِي الْخَلْوَةِ, even when alone. على الصحيح, according to the sound opinion, إِلَّا لِغَرَضٍ صَحِيح, except if it's for a good reason. Right? Which is a recognized need or benefit. Recognized need, you need to use the toilet, you need to take a shower, you need to change your clothes, in the context of intimacy or intercourse, etc. Right? 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 Allahu Akbar. Jazakallah khair. Alhamdulillah. Right? So, the basis of this is two things. One is that the divine command related to covering one's awrah is not conditioned by in front of other people. So the Sahaba asked Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam about this. Right? The Sahaba asked Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam about this. Right? And he said, alayhi salatu wasalam, Allahu ahaqqu an yustaha minhu min an-nas. Right? Allah is more deserving of your shyness than people are. Right? And right? So here, the basic awrah, even when it's alone, is between navel and knee, even for um, right? Right? So this is something that's often, there is a second opinion in the Hanafi madhab of it being recommended to cover one's awrah when alone, but makruh to uncover it without need. That also exists, but it's considered a much less strong opinion. Right? So
if someone is in like a small one-person tent, do the walls of the tent constitute a covering?
no, because they're not wearing. Satr al-awrah is ما يعد لابسا له, right? What you're wearing. So for example, if you're swimming, right? Right? Can you swim naked? No, you shouldn't. There's some discussion, like what if you could go into the water, remove your clothing, and swim, in a way that none of your awrah is visible, in murky water. And that's a theoretical issue, because normally some part of your nakedness would be visible, and water tends to be clear. But they discussed that theoretical possibility. We don't need to go into things like that. But they've thought that through carefully. Right? Uncovering in, and we'll see the other rulings related to it. The main point here was that this is something that a lot of people are negligent about, right? About uncovering. And the hikmat at-tashri', and if you look at the hadith of lubs, of libas, dressing and undressing of the Prophet ﷺ, it's sunnah that whenever one does uncover, one reduces the uncovering, qadran wa zamanan, in terms of extent and duration. Right, so with respect to clothing, what does one wear? That which covers more of the awrah first. Duna takalluf, right? Because if someone puts on a heavy jilbab, but they're not wearing their something underneath yet, then it'll be very difficult to put the rest of the clothing on, right? Or something awkward like that, right? But broadly speaking, it's sunnah to dress sitting down, right? For the same reason, etc. Likewise with ghusl. It's from the adab of ghusl to make ghusl sitting down where possible for the same reason, right? And some of the things we discussed in ghusl. Okay. وَمِنْهَا سَتْرُ الْعَوْرَةِ. But the details are coming, right? So he says, لِلْإِجْمَاعِ عَلَى افْتِرَاضِهِ, because of the obligation, the consensus that it is obligatory to cover one's awrah. Right? Right? And this is within the prayer, right? Outside of the prayer, you can see some of the details. Tahtawi references. Al-Halabi took the opinion of wujub of satr al-awrah, right? When alone. And the Sharih said no. Who's the Sharih? Abu Saud, right? Correct? Who does Tahtawi refer to as a Sharih? So if you look in the Imdad, you'll see a discussion related to this, right? On the issue, right? Okay. وَلَوْ فِي ظُلْمَةٍ. Even if you're in the dark. So on a moonless night, you're praying in the woods and no one's around, you still have to cover your awrah. Right? وَشَرْطُ سَتْرُهَا مِنْ جَوَانِبِهِ. The obligation is that it be covered from the sides. Not from above. So if someone's praying and they have so they're just wearing one thobe and got a big neck, and if they go into ruku' they can see their own awrah, it doesn't affect their prayer. Because the shart is that it be from the jawanib, from the sides. Meaning not from above and not from below. But, common sense is obvious. وَلَا يَضُرُّ نَظَرُهَا مِنْ جَيْبِهِ. It doesn't affect the validity of the prayer to see the awrah from, what's the jayb? The jayb is not the jayb does not, in modern Arabic, jayb generally refers to pocket. But jayb is al-manfadh. Right? But it's poor adab to be dressed like that. في قول عامة المشايخ, according to most of the scholars. عامة المشايخ does not mean المشايخ العوام, not the common scholars. عامة أي الأكثر, أكثر المشايخ. المشايخ أي أهل التصحيح. Right? ولا يضر لو نظرها أحد من أسفل ذيله. And there's it does not harm if someone sees it from below. لأن التكلف لمنعه فيه حرج, because being responsible to prevent it from all ways would be difficult. So someone but of course عند القدرة يحتاط when able. So for example, someone only has one item of clothing, right? They only have a thobe, but they don't have money for pants or an izar. Can they go up flights of stairs? Yes, and it'll be people's responsibility not to look. Like, why are you staring at them? That's haram, another haram. So you're not responsible for that. But obviously, that's why the sunnah is one wears qamis and an izar or a sirwal, etc. Right? Okay. وثوب الحرير والمغصوب والأرض الغير تصح فيها الصلاة مع الكراهة. Prayer is valid with prohibited dislike, كراهة تحريم, right? As al-Tahtawi makes clear, quoting as-Sayyid and others, right? So prayer is valid yet prohibitively disliked in silk clothes and in misappropriated clothes. Al-ghasb, what's ghasb? Yeah, I said that. What does it mean? Right? It's أخذ الشيء من غير حق. So it doesn't have to be stolen. So for example, let's say I'm staying with some brother named Basir. Right? Now Basir is very particular about his clothes. I sent all my clothes to the dry cleaners. I said, I need to pray Fajr. I'll just use one of Basir's thobes. My prayer is valid, but using something without permission is ghasb, is misappropriation. Right? Even if you intend to return it, etc. Right? And it's sinful. And then there's other distinct something. Sometimes just taking and keeping something could be ghasb, and sometimes it would be sariqah. But theft is when something is protected. When it's unprotected, it would be misappropriation, but not necessarily theft. But they're both sinful. But they have differing possibilities. Anyway, وَأَرْضِ الْغَيْرِ, and praying on someone else's land without their permission. Because it's their land. You don't have a right over it. Right? So you couldn't, so it's in winter. Let's say you break into someone's building to pray indoors rather than pray outdoors. You can't do that. Right? You can't do that. You can't pray on private parking space, for example, if you're not allowed to be there. Right? With karaha, because it's the rights of people. That's why it's mentioned that if someone forbids you from praying on their property, then one prays on this, on the side of the street. Because it's not your intrinsic right to pray on someone else's property. Now, there's a separate thing in terms of employment law, etc. But for example, a non-Muslim hired you, they tell you, you can't pray on my property. Now, you don't have some natural right to pray on someone else's property. It's their property. Now, if the law of the land allows you, then that would supersede an individual's rights in that sense. That's a separate issue, right? Of reasonable accommodation and so on. But they could limit your right to where to pray. That's why historically the ulama have been said live in Muslim lands, right? But that's a separate thing. Nas'alullah al-afiyah wal-hifz. Okay. He says, وَسَنَذْكُرُهُ, and we'll mention the details. وَالْمُسْتَحَبْ أَنْ يُصَلِّيَ فِي ثَلَاثَةِ ثِيَابٍ. It's recommended one pray in 3 items of clothing. مِنْ أَحْسَنِ ثِيَابِهِ, from the best of your clothing. Okay? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us, خُذُوا زِينَتَكُمْ. Okay? Take off your adornment. So the zina, this أقل الزينة is someone said أقل الزين ما يستر الشين. Right? The least of adornment is to cover that which is unbecoming. Right? But then there's a proper, which is that which would be dignified. And the praiseworthy, which is al-ahsan. Right? ثيابي قميص وإزار وعمامة. قميص, which is a long shirt. إزار أو مثل الإزار is the sirwal, is the trousers. The Prophet ﷺ accepted trousers as a gift. It's not specifically related that he wore them. But now, the fact that he accepted them and we don't know that he gave them away right away, and he didn't keep things without need, that's discussed in the works of Shama'il. هل لبس النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم السروال أم لا? Of course, there's one of those wacky fatwas, but beware of where you get fatwas from, that women can't wear trousers. There's some people who go around insisting on that. There's a scholar who's become a lot more balanced now. When I was in university, I kept away from this guy. 3 times he asked me to tell his cousin to please wear trousers under her jilbab. Like, I don't know. It's like, why? Like, firstly, why do you know what your cousin is wearing under her jilbab? Like, leave her alone. And then the cousin tells me, please tell so and so to stop telling me what to wear. I was like, please leave me out of this argument. Like, Nas'alullah al-afiyah. But there's no basis for that, right? That a trouser is not tashabbuh, right? Wearing a trouser is not tashabbuh, right? Because trousers or the sirwal is worn by men and it's worn by women, as long as it has the... So anyways, right? Tahtawi says this, right? He says هذا للرجل وفي المرأة قميص وخمار وسراويل. Right? Is a qamis, of course, qamis means a long shirt. وخمار is, is that which covers the head and the chest area, right? That's the legal definition of khimar. وسراويل and trousers or their equivalent, right? That's عند الاختيار. When not possible, one does what one is able to, right? Right? ويكره في إزار أي وحده مع القدرة عليها. Right? يعني عليها على ماذا؟ It's makruh, it's dislike, meaning تنزيها في إزار وحده. It's makruh to pray only in an izar when يعني مع القدرة عليها. What does Damir go back to here? على الثلاثة ثياب, right? Right, عليه. That's what one should have, like the dama'ir, one should unpack them before class, please. Right? It's disliked to pray in an izar alone if you could pray in more than that. Likewise, in praying only in trousers, without a shirt, right? And there's hadith that's come related to this, that نهى رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم أن يصلي الرجل في ثوب ليس على عاتقه شيء. The Prophet ﷺ forbade that a person pray in one piece. في ثوب, ثوب means in one piece of cloth, like an izar. Thobe does not mean what we call the thobe. Thobe here means one piece of cloth. ليس على عاتقه شيء, with their shoulders uncovered, meaning without need. Right? And this is mentioned. So, Tahtawi says that the karahas of tahrim, right, because of the prohibition, and has a mahal kalam, right, that this is, right, that this is, because this goes against al-mustahab. So another, that this nahi is, this command is related to adab, so there's a strong case that it's for istihbab, for recommendation. Allahu alam. Right? There's a lot more, the details of the ahkam of awrah, you can see, we will be coming to them. وَمِنْهَا اسْتِقْبَالُ الْقِبْلَةِ. From that is facing the qibla. Right? Now qibla, things like this, make a habit to look things up in the dictionary, because some people get upset about, because qibla has a general sense in the Arabic language. It has a specific meaning, which is al-qibla al-ma'huda lis-salah, etc., lil-istiqbal. Okay, so here it means that, because qibla, right, in the Arabic, so al-Jawhari says that yuqalu min ayna qiblatuka, right? Where is your direction? Right? You can, they even says, oh, ma li kalamihi qibla. His words have no qibla, mean they don't have any direction. Right? The general meaning. Right? Right? So the poets use this as well. Right? 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 That, and they toy between, often one of the things the poets do, that they tease the reader to think, to imagine between the specific meaning and the general meaning of a word. Right? 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 Okay. And the Qibla, if you look in Tahtawi, he gives you a al-Qibla shar'an. He gives the definition from al-Quhustani. Right? Al-Quhustani was a book called Jami' al-Rumuz, which is a commentary on al-Nuqaya. The Nuqaya is a mukhtasar of the Wiqaya. As a very interesting family of great scholars. One wrote the Wiqaya, and then the Nuqaya was written. The Wiqaya summarized the Masail of the Hidayah as a matan. The Masail in the matan of the Hidayah and in the Sharh. And key Masail, not all of them, in the matan. To facilitate understanding the Hidayah. So historically, in many parts of the world, in much of the Muslim world, or in a lot of it, before they study the Hidayah, they study Sharh al-Wiqaya. And Sharh al-Wiqaya, they would look at the issues of the madhab with its reasoning, but they wouldn't go into the difference of opinion with the other schools. So that once one reached the Hidayah, one was sort of cruising. The issues of the madhab itself you've studied before. So then you can really get to what distinguishes the Hidayah of the distinguishing istidlal, etc. Anyways, so the Nuqaya was written to abridge the Wiqaya. It's very terse matan, hard to follow in parts. Many a great Hanafi wrote commentaries on it, the Nuqaya. Now the most famous is Mulla Ali al-Qari, Fathu Bab al-Inaya fi Sharh al-Nuqaya. And if you have Safahat min Sabr al-Ulama of Shaykh Abdul Fattah Abu Ghudda, it's a beautiful story of his teacher told him to find this book, Fath Bab al-Inaya. He didn't find it, because this is like in the 40s in Egypt, after the collapse of the Ottomans and the devastation in the Muslim world and the World War taking place and all these things. al-Kawthari died, I think, 1951 or so. And Shaykh Abdul Fattah remained years, even after return back to Halab from Cairo, looking for this book. But Syria was in a tough situation at that time too, and the connections between the Muslim world were weakened, etc. He'd heard that had been published somewhere in Central Asia. In one of the Central Asia. It was published in Qazan. And there was a strong Hanafi scholarly tradition there, and very interesting history of why there's publishing in Qazan, and because of the Tsars actually, and the printing and the emergence of the printing press in the Russian Empire. But that's a separate story. So he spent years looking for it, writing letters across the Muslim world, looking for it. Then finally, when he was able to go to Hajj, his biggest concern was to find this book. Why? Because his teacher said to find it. And you can find, the Safhat min Sabr al-Ulama is online, and Shaykh Abdul Fattah has amazing indexes. And the story is worth reading. It's literally most of his tawaf was Fath Bab al-Inaya. And even then he found out that there's this one trader. So he spent days just at the door of this man, waiting for him to come. A long story, and you can find out the ending, but let it be sort of. Shaykh Abdul Fattah's story, though, didn't have a complete ending, in that Shaykh Abdul Fattah published one volume, just Kitab al-Tahara of Fath Bab al-Inaya. Partly because Shaykh Abdul Fattah was so particular about everything that he did. And he published a lot. But this is taking his time, partly because this was in honor of his teacher. And the one volume he did is spectacular. But he never, nothing else has been published even 20 years after the passing of the Shaykh. It's said that there's more that he edited, but it's never come out. But others have published it, Fath Bab al-Inaya. Mullah Ali al-Qari writes very clearly, and he sticks to the relied upon positions and so on broadly. It's a great, great text. There's a number of other important commentaries on the Nuqaya, amongst them by Ash-Shumunni and others. And arguably the historically most important sharh on the Nuqaya, fiqh-wise, is al-Quhustani. Al-Quhustani, his book is not reliable, but it's brilliant. So, but books like that one doesn't touch until one knows what one's doing. Right? Until then, be careful of secondary books. Right? It's like, why? He said, have you read the major books of hadith? No. So I'm reading the Muntaqa of Ibn Jarud. Why? Have you read the Muwatta? No. Have you read Riyadh al-Salihin? No. Have you read the Muwatta? No. Have you read Mishkat al-Masabih? No. Have you read Bukhari? No. Muslim? No. Abu Dawud? No. But I want to read Ibn Khuzaymah. Okay. Right? That's, there's a tartib for things. Anyways, so al-Quhustani, and Quhustan, of course, is from Kuhistan. Kuhistan. So sometimes, usually they write it in this way, but sometimes written with a kaf. Kuhistan. But the Arabs don't like pronouncing things like Kuhistan. So I say al-Quhustani. Right? Because of the ha. Anyways, that's how ta'arib works. So he gives a definition. Jihatun yusalli nahwaha. جهة يصلي نحوها من في الأرض السابعة إلى السماء السابعة ممن يحاذي الكعبة أو جهتها. Right? It is the direction in which, towards which those on earth pray. From the seven earths to the seven heavens. Right? So it's the Kaaba and above. Right? And the Kaaba and below. Till the middle of the earth. It doesn't go beyond. Right? So if you say, okay, the exact opposite point of the Kaaba is Sydney University, let's say, you don't pray towards Sydney University, right? You pray towards the Kaaba. Right? It goes into the middle of the earth, but doesn't go point out from the other side, right? For obvious reasons, right? Anyways. الاستقبال, the Sharih says, من قبلت الماشية الوادي بمعنى قابلته. استقبال means, is from when the flock faced the valley, meaning they were in its direction. So this is pointing to the fact that this istaf'ala, istaqbala is not للطلب. It's not طلب مواجهة القبلة, but it is بمعنى مواجهة القبلة. Right? Because the istaf'ala pattern is either has a معنى of طلب or حصول. And here it's ليس بمعنى الطلب. Okay. That's why he says وليست السين للطلب. The sin, meaning the istaf'ala, right, is not for طلب. It's not طلب التوجه لأن الشرط المقابلة. Because the condition is to be facing, not لا لأن شرط المقابلة لا طلبها وهو شرط بالكتاب والسنة والإجماع, and it's a condition by the book of Allah, فولي وجهك شطر المسجد الحرام, and many other verses, والسنة, many hadiths of the Prophet صلى الله عليه وسلم, لا يقبل الله تعالى صلاة امرئ حتى يضع الطهور موضعه ويستقبل القبلة. The footnote is inserted in the wrong place in our commentary. If you notice, because the actual point of mentioning the hadith is ويستقبل القبلة. In Tahtawi, at the bottom, والمراد منها بقعتها, and what's meant by the qibla is the place, not the building. بقعتها, المراد بقعتها لا البناء, not the building itself. حتى لو نوى بناء الكعبة لا يجوز. Of course, nobody would do this, and don't get bad ideas and don't give people bad ideas. So don't intend to pray to the building itself. Does anyone intend to pray? I'm praying to the building, but not to the qibla. Nobody would intend that. So this is just a theoretical issue, should not be mentioned to the common person, right? Right? So I'm praying towards towards the Kaaba. Why? Meaning to that place. You're not praying to the stones. So don't get weird ideas. But this is, and they say the sign that you're praying to the building. So okay, what happened if someone picked the building up and put it in Adan? Where would you pray?
No, if he's praying to the building.
Yeah, if they're praying to the building. But where would you pray? To the place, the buq'a. Right? Good. Right? لا يجوز إلا أن يريد به جهة الكعبة, unless what they mean that I'm praying to the Kaaba, meaning the direction of the Kaaba. وإن نوى المحراب لا يجوز. If your intention is the mihrab, unless by the mihrab you mean the qibla. Right? But things like this, don't. They say, لا تورطوا العوام. Don't confuse the common person, right? And that's one of the things that we need to be careful about as well, but it deserves mentioning, that the degree of religious literacy has dropped dramatically. Dramatically, right? Even if sometimes we underestimate our elders, right? You look at some old people who don't know a lot, etc., but you ask them questions. What about this? What about this? Why? Because when they're small, they're learning these things in simple language, etc. But the thing to be careful about is some of the books that we now have. They're written because common people need to know, what if this happens, what if this happens, right? But those books were were authored for people who'd gone through maktab, who'd gone through primary Islamic schooling, who'd done X number of years of religious study, and the more educated people kept the company of the ulama, etc. So the degree of their religious literacy is a lot wider. But even these books, like Nur al-Idah, the Maraqi, any of these books, Hadiyah al-Ala'iyya, these are not fit for the common person to read, to be taught to. Why? Because a lot of the details, these require unpacking. Right? The details are too many because they don't have any foundation. And they presuppose things that the person doesn't have. Why? They've not kept the company of the ulama, they've not lived in a religious environment. This happens even in the Arab world. Right? Even in the Arab world, right? Like many people, even in places like Syria, right? There's, many people after what happened in the late 70s, early 80s were very scared to be around religious people. Just because what they'd been through. Right? So Umar used to go to the University of Damascus, and there was this one teacher Well, I knew about because one of my friends was trying to get married to her. Right? Which is a very weird situation. Other guys there, I used to go to pick up Omar, and they used to refer to as fitna lady. So I'm stuck in fitna ladies class. But Omar, who's a person of deep firasa, always, really liked this teacher. He was one of the most sincere people I've met in Damascus. But her story, she had a parent who was killed in the conflict. There's all these kinds of things. But many people, even in Muslim lands, grew up distant from the ulama and from the thing. So you give them something this detailed and they read things like this. Oh my God, I just prayed towards the mihrab. My prayer is not valid. So it causes them waswasa. So you have to be very, very careful. حدثوا الناس على قدر عقولهم. Right? Address people to the extent of their understanding. أتحبون أن يكذب الله ورسوله. Do you wish that Allah and His Messenger be denied? Right? So this requires awareness. And if something like this is ever mentioned, it is our duty to clarify it. Right? But if you go to the masjid, you pray towards the mihrab. Khalas. So much so that they actually mention that where there are mihrabs that are established from the Sahaba, it is not permitted to re-look at them and pray elsewhere if it's established. One of those places being Jami' Bani Umayyah. Right? It's established, this qibla, their masajid, like that, the Jami' of Sayyidina Amr ibn al-As in Cairo. Right? There's a whole number of masajid that are established by the companions. If you have Poured in a Storm by Shaykh Keller, they mentioned, because they actually went and measured how the qibla was from those masajid. Right? And these are far. There's some masajid in Yemen, some in Eastern Arabia, then in Cairo, Jami' Bani Umayyah. I don't know if they counted that, but the fuqaha did consider it to the qibla. And the variance from the exact qibla was less than 2 degrees. I forget the exact number, but it's certainly less than 2 degrees. Or it's like tiny. فللمكي المشاهد, so for the Meccan who can المشاهد أي للكعبة, the Meccan who can see the Kaaba itself, فرضه إصابة عينها, their obligation is to face it exactly. اتفاقا, by agreement, لقدرته عليه يقينا, because they're certainly able to face the Qibla itself. والفرض لغير المشاهد, and the obligation for other than that, إصابة جهتها, is to face its direction. أي الكعبة هو الصحيح, and this is the sound opinion. Right? And this goes back to the principle that التكليف بقدر الوسع, right? And so basically and they describe it in a complex way. We'll look at that. But the basic thing, there are 4 directions. Right? North, south, east, west. So a direction is that you be within 45 degrees each way of the Qibla. Now how do you figure that out? We're not going to go into a lot of detail we're going to read what it says. Right? Right? وَنِيَّةُ الْقِبْلَةِ لَيْسَتْ بِشَرْطٍ. It's not a condition that one intend to face the Qibla. Why? Imam al-Tahtawi رحمة الله تعالى عليه said لأنه من الوسائل وهي لا تحتاج إلى النية. Right? Because facing the Qibla is a means, and the means don't require intention. كالوضوء فشرط حصولها لا تحصيلها. Right? This is a beautiful expression, right? And they use similar things. And some even put العبرة في الشروط حصولها لا تحصيلها. The condition in the consideration in conditions that they be met, not to be sought. When you stand to pray, do you intend with my nakedness covered? you have to intend your nakedness? No. Do you have to intend that the time is in? No. Do you have to intend that I have no najasa on me? No. And this applies across the board. Do you have to intend the witnesses in a transaction? No. Like in marriage where it's a condition? No. الحصول لا التحصيل. Okay. والتوجه إليها يغنيه عن النية. And facing it frees them of the need of intending it. Right? هو الأصح. Right? Not that's a, facing it frees you from the which niyyah? The niyyah of facing the qibla. Because facing the qibla doesn't free you of the need, because you have to intend the specific prayer. Right? When it comes to the fard. والتوجه إليها يغنيه عن النية هو الأصح. Right? And they mention right? And the qibla, they give ways. How do you figure out the qibla when you're away from people, etc.? Practical caution. Now everyone says, I have a phone, I have a GPS, etc. But what if your phone dies? Especially if you're out camping, this, that. That in general, one should take the means, right? It's recommended to take the means, right? Be prepared. You're going on a journey by road. You're going to be on the road for 10 hours. If you and it's winter, like what? The angels are going to like put their angel wings down for you to pray on? Even if they did, you won't, they're in their own dimension. Most likely, you won't be praying on their wings, right? So you take the means, right? What are you going to pray on? Yani warabitu, right? Fortify yourselves, right? Know in advance where you're going to stop and pray, right? How do you figure out the qibla and that place, right? So these are things. You have a layover in a certain place to know the times, this and that, because sometimes it can be challenging. It can be challenging, right? Many airports have places to pray, but some of them you can't. It's way too far between your connecting flights, right? It's a good thing to do to have a compass. When we were traveling a lot, we used to keep a compass in the car, right? I think Umar still has it, right? Because things happen, your phone is dead, there's interference, all kinds of things. So one takes the means to know in advance what are the times of prayer going to be, etc. And they give the furu' related to that in Tahtawi. So he says, وجهتها هي التي إذا توجه إليها الإنسان يكون مسامتا للكعبة أو لهوائها حقيقة أو تقريبا. Its direction is that which if you face it, you will be in the semt, in line with the Kaaba or its air, right? Right? تحقيقا, actually, if you're facing it, أو تقريبا, or within its direction. ومعنى التحقيق أنه لو فرض خط من تلقاء وجهه على زاوية قائمة إلى الأفق يكون مارا على الكعبة. Facing it تحقيقا is if you take a line from your forehead straight to the horizon, you would pass by the Kaaba. That's direction, right? أو هوائها, or its air, like if you're on a mountain, for example, right? or in the air. ومعنى التقريب, and what's meant by approximation, that we are within the jihah, أن يكون ذلك منحرفا عن الكعبة أو هوائها انحرافا لا تزول به المقابلة بالكلية. And by closeness is that you are within the scope by which facing it is not fully vitiated. How? بأن يبقى شيء من سطح الوجه مسامتا لها. That something of your forehead is in line with it. And your forehead ends at basically 45 degrees, right? Like if you turn away, and you could run some experiments. They do these diagrams, which I could draw it for you. I couldn't explain it to you, because this verges into science. So, أو لهوائها, and likewise if you're on a mountain or something, or to its air, right? ولغير المشاهد إصابة جهتها, and the one who doesn't see it, they only have to face its direction. البعيد والقريب سواء. This applies to one distant or close. You parked your car in the parking lot of one of the hotels in Mecca. That's not far from the Kaaba. But then you got locked in the parking lot. So you don't know which way the Qibla is. So you just try to face the direction. I asked Shaykh Adib Kallas, rahimahullah, that what if you know the exact direction of the Qibla and you're far? Do you have to face it? He said, لا نسلم. I said, what? He said, we don't accept the premise. Said, what do you mean, Sayyidi? Because this is a difference with the Shafi'is on it. If you're able to face the exact Qibla, why would you face away? He said, أصلا لا نسلم. So he took an example. Okay? He said, look, even if something is close, right? That if you take a piece of paper and say, okay, draw a line towards that, the disabled button. You try to draw it, then if you measure and you try to go close, try to measure exactly, will it get you exactly there? Even a slight variation, even a small area like this will cause the deviation magnifies. That even if you're a little bit away from you're a little bit off, you'll be touching the Kaaba anyways. Okay? So we don't accept the premise to begin with. And that's part of the ikhtilaf between the Hanafis and the Shafi'is. And part of it goes back to what is meant by التوجه للقبلة, right? What's commanded in the Quran is فَوَلِّ وَجْهَكَ, right? Direct your face. So the jiha, you're still, there's أصل المواجهة حاصلة when you're facing, right? فَوَلِّ وَجْهَكَ, turn your face, so you're within, when you're in the direction, your face is in that area. And the work, so that's why the argument with respect to North America that the Qibla is east is science fiction, because if you face east, you'll never get to the Kaaba. That the Qibla is southeast, you'll end up in, depending how south you go east, you'll end up in Cape Town or Durban or wherever else. You won't end up in Mecca. So it's poor, it doesn't work, right? It doesn't work. And this is the position, across the board, and it's a serious problem, right? It's a serious problem. There's some things that لا تقبل الخلاف, really. That the Muslims are, a Muslim, forget Ahl al-Sunnah, anyone who's accepted as being from Ahl al-Islam, they're called Ahl al-Qibla, the people of the Qibla, right? Like the Qibla is the Qibla is a factual thing, not a matter of opinion, right? And to face something, istiqbal or tawajjuh, that if I told you right now, I'm facing the window over there, what would you say? You needed an Afghan to answer the obvious question. Said, no, I am facing it because I'm going to go that way and then turn left and that way. I'll get there. But is that facing? No, it's obvious, right? To face something, right? It's also premised on the idea that the world is on a flat map of the earth. How do you maps, flat maps are a human a two-dimensional recreation of a three-dimensional reality. Right? Right? That you take an orange, or tangerine, remove the peel. Now try to put it in a rectangle. What's going to happen? The peel doesn't fit. You have to flatten it all out, you have to either make cuts, right? Or you have to, well, with the orange peel we can't, you have to compress some things, make other things bigger. And this is discussed in Port in a Storm. If you can get a copy of that, it's a gem, but it's important to have. And many of the ulama have written about this. One of the great Hanafis who've written about it, Maulana Sayyid Yusuf al-Binnuri, one of the greatest students of Imam al-Kashmiri, has a book called Bughyatul Arib في معرفة المحاريب في معرفة القبلة ما بعرف كذا والمحاريب. It's a good work. And then important, like the great centers of Islamic learning across the Muslim world all give fatwa, like with respect to North America with the northeastern Qibla. The other things, people who say are either sects or individual opinions, they're okay, say أخطأ يعني مأجور وإن أخطأ. We say okay, inshallah they have reward even if they're in error. If someone's facing other than the northeastern Qibla, if they're outside the Jiha, I would not create a scene, but I would never pray behind them. Because it's not a matter of ijtihad. And the spreading of something like that is seriously problematic. If it's within the Jiha, we don't create any consternation. Right? Now, if you're on the masjid committee, etc., the masjid is slightly at variance, you say, okay, don't make a scene. Right? Sometimes it's not from wisdom. Like a masjid, let's say, to create the sufuf at a slight angle would be very inconvenient, right? It would confuse a lot of things. Then sisters would end up, they could cause, so that returns to the judgment of the people responsible for it. If it's within 45 degrees, the Qibla is this way, they're not praying that way, but then they're not facing the Qibla. Then, there is leeway. Now, how specifically you apply that in a community context, ask the learned, pious scholars of that community. Right? Okay. It says, وَلَوْ بِمَكَّةِ وَحَالَ بَيْنَهُ وَبَيْنَ الْكَعْبَةِ بِنَاءٌ أَوْ جَبَلٌ. Even if you're in Mecca and there's between you and the Kaaba, buildings or a mountain. For example, على الصحيح, right? According to the sound opinion. كما في الدراية والتجنيس. The Diraya, one of the commentaries on the Hidayah, and the Tajnis of Imam al-Marghinani, التجنيس والمزيد. The Tajnis wal-Mazid is an important work. He wrote it after the Hidayah, so it has significance in that sense as well. وَمِنَ الشُّرُوط الْوَقْتِ. Now, one of the interesting things, he'll tell us that many of the great works of the madhab don't mention the time as one of the conditions. Not because it's not one of the conditions, but because it's already been mentioned. Iktifa'an. Right? But it's one of those curious things, right? Because you'd assume that you'd mention something as important as time. But they don't mention it. لَعَلَّهُ. Right? So he says, وَالْوَقْتِ. From the conditions is the time. To summarize it, there's two things. الوقت واعتقاد دخوله. Right? So الوقت أن يكون الوقت داخلا في حد في نفسه. The time has to be in. So, and you have to believe it's in. So, if you believe the time was in, but it wasn't, and you prayed, let's say you prayed Maghrib now. Is the time in? No. But you believed it was in. The condition has two parts. Al-waqtu nafsuhu, the time itself, and that you believed it's in. But let's say someone was feeling lazy. Say, okay, Maghrib's in, let's say, you know what, I'm going to go to sleep, and I'll say, so Maghrib wasn't in. Maghrib was in. Someone didn't think Maghrib was in with the new chime change, etc. They're confused. So you know what? I can't wait till Maghrib comes in. I'm going to pray now and go to sleep. So the time was in, but they didn't believe it to be in. What happens? It's also not valid. But that's far-fetched. Don't give people bad ideas, right? But if it happens, that's the ruling. Okay. ومن الشروط الوقت للفرائض الخمس بالكتاب والسنة والإجماع. By the book of Allah, إن الصلاة كانت على المؤمنين كتابا موقوتا. And right, from Surah An-Nisa, verse 103. Right? And Imam al-Tahtawi gives a really nice definition of what is mentioned. Right? The asl with respect to the times is this verse. إن الصلاة كانت على المؤمنين كتابا موقوتا, from Surah An-Nisa, verse 103. أي فرضا موقوتا, أي محدودا بأوقات, delimited by times. لا يجوز تقديمها ولا تأخيرها عنه عند القدرة على فعلها فيها. Right? And because the hadith of the imama of Jibril alayhi salam, of the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wasallam. Okay. وقد نص على اشتراطه في عدة من المعتمدات. The time being a condition has been explicitly affirmed in a number of the considered works of the madhab. Right? وقد ترك ذكر الوقت في باب شروط الصلاة في عدة من المعتمدات. But the mention of the time has been omitted from a number of important books in the madhab. That's a problem. كالقدوري, such as قدوري. والمختار of الموصلي. والهداية. Of course, the hidayah follows its matan is largely taken from قدوري. والكنز. Right? مع بيانهم الأوقات, despite their detailing the times. And the ishkal, as al-Tahtawi says, is that even though they mentioned it earlier, these mutun are also offered for the one learning. وَالْمُتَعَلِّمْ قَاصِرٌ, and the learner does not get subtleties. Right? So there's other explanations given as well. Amongst them, that potentially, this one is iktifa, this already mentioned. The other is that what is the relationship between the time and the prayer? That's another argument. That no, time is not of the conditions of the prayer, because prayer has no existence without the time. The fard has no existence without the time, right? So it's a different type of condition, right? Like, can you pray Maghrib right now? Say, no, but my awra is covered, I don't have najasa, I have intention, I have istiqbal al-qibla, I said Allahu Akbar. Right? Because there is no Maghrib prayer without the time. That's another line of argument, right? Premised on what is the relationship between al-amr, between the command and its fulfillment, and ada, So the relationship between ada and al-waqt, between the time, between fulfilling the time and al-ada, performing the prayer, and the time. But so Imam al-Shurunbulali says, وَلَا أَعْلَمُ سِرَّ عَدَمِ ذِكْرِهِمْ لَهُ. I don't know, this is Imam al-Shurunbulali saying, but you also see their humility, right? I don't know. He could come up with some fancy excuse. So لا أعلم, I don't know. سِرَّ عَدَمِ ذِكْرِهِمْ. But sir, what is a sir? المعنى الذي يخفى عادة. I don't know the sir. Right? But this also, I don't know the sirra عدم ذكرهم له. The sir is المعنى الثابت الخفي. It's a meaning that is affirmed, right? Right? So here there's a great deal of humility, right? I don't know the subtle reality behind this. وإن كان يتصف بأنه سبب للأداء وظرف للمؤدى. This goes back to an issue of right, that even though the time, because this is answering the issue, right, which some of the commentators on those works have mentioned. Then why didn't they mention this? Two main reasons given. One is that it's already mentioned, so it doesn't need to be mentioned. The other is that what I mentioned before, but that's problematic. Because he says, وَإِن كَانَ يَتَّصِفُ بِأَنَّهُ سَبَبٌ لِلْأَدَاءِ. Because the prayer, because there's different types of relationship between ada and waqt. Right? So the time here is a cause for fulfilling it. Right? For fulfilling the command. سبب لأداء الأمر. يعني أي المأمور. It's a cause for fulfilling it. وظرف للمؤدى. And the fulfillment takes place in that time. As opposed to something that becomes due. So for example, when there's a due date, right, so the hawl, it comes in, but when the hawl is done, is the payment done within the hawl? No. It is just, like when is zakat due? When the hawl is complete. Once it's complete, the hawalan al-hawl is a sabab for giving zakat, but the hawl there is like your zakat becomes due 21st Rajab. Once 21st Rajab is gone, are you fulfilling the command when it's due? No, it's after it. But here, this is a cause for the fulfillment of the command, and the command is done, it's a dharf, within this time. So therefore, it should be considered a condition. Right? So, وَشَرْطٌ لِلْوُجُوبِ, and it's a condition for it to be obligatory. That's another sign that it should be considered a condition. كما هو مقرر في محله, as is detailed in its place, which is مبحث الأمر, right? مبحث الأمر في كتب الأصول, right? And if you look in Al-Mujaz of Al-As'adi, you can read up on that. وَيُشْتَرَطُ اعْتِقَادُ دُخُولِهِ, one must believe that the time is in. لِتَكُونَ عِبَادَتُهُ بِنِيَّةٍ جَازِمَةٍ, in order for one's worship to be with a firm intention. I don't know the time's in. I'm praying for the sake of Allah. I'm praying Dhuhr, but is Dhuhr in? I don't know. Then, are you really praying Dhuhr? I hope so. That's a flimsy intention. لأن الشاك ليس بجازم, because the one in doubt doesn't have resolve. حتى لو صلى وعنده أن الوقت لم يدخل فظهر أنه كان قد دخل لا تجزئه. So much so that if they prayed and they think that the time hasn't entered, but it actually had, this prayer is not valid. لأنه لما حكم بفساد صلاته بناء على دليل شرعي وهو تحريه لا ينقلب جائزا. Because once they deem that their prayer was not valid by their own judgment, then if it turned out to be valid, it doesn't turn valid. ويخاف عليه في دينه. And they're to be feared for someone deliberately prays before the time. That's very dangerous. حتى, but of course, but then there's an issue. They say يصح الأداء والقضاء بنية الأداء والقضاء. A current performance and a makeup are both valid with the stated intention of a current performance or a past performance. So let's say someone lived on the equator, right? So let's say the times are the same. Let's say Maghrib comes in 6 p.m., just theoretically, right? Someone, they got their watch wrong for 5 years. Every day they prayed 5 minutes early. For 5 years. How many prayers do they have to make up? So they prayed 5 years of Maghrib prayer 5 minutes early.
365 times 1.
How many prayers do they have to make up?
18,000.
No. How many prayers do they have to make up?
4 times 365.
One prayer.
1,000.
One prayer. Why? Yeah, the others would count as a makeup. Right? Because this is built on another supposition that هل يشترط في القضاء التعيين? Does the qada have to be specified? And there's 3 opinions. You have to specify the specific prayer you're making up, and that's the strictest opinion. Like by date. And that you don't tell people that opinion because people struggle to make it up. The other is you don't have to specify at all. And the third is you just intend either the last ta'yin umuman, the general specification, the last fard that is due upon me, or the first one that's due upon me. But in this situation, and there's khilaf, because there are 3 opinions on this within the madhab, but according to that opinion, you only have to make up one prayer. But don't be hasty in giving fatwa, right? Because you don't make things up like that. You have to be really careful, right? But if someone consistently prayed early, only one prayer would be due. Because you can't do that deliberately, right? But this will count for yesterday's prayer, right? Then he says, وَيُشْتَرَطُ النِّيَّةُ, right? Then the intention is required, right? Now, Imam Ash-Shurunbulali did not rigorously define intention necessarily, right? And there's some criticisms of what he said. Right? But, because the irada al-jazima, so he says, النية وهي الإرادة الجازمة. It is, the irada is the determination that is resolute. Right? Irada, the determination that is resolute. But, right? So there's ijmal here. There's a little bit of brevity here. Because normally something as important as intention, you'd first say what is it in the language. And the language, niyyah, has a broad sense. It overlaps a range of things. Right? Right? مذ نويت السفر للحبيب الأغر فرماني القدر عند قطب الزمان فقلت يا سيدي فاخذا بيدي للبهال etc etc etc. Right? So nawait, because why? Because in the nawa, in the Arabic, in general Arabic, nawait has the meaning of azm, that you've decided something, right? Right? Like, you know, someone, let's say it's 2 months ago, someone said, nawait an ahuj hadhi sana. But then the niyatul hajj, in reality, what is it? Is what you do when you enter into ihram. Right? 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 Someone's going towards the masjid, they say, nawaitu nusalli fi Jamia Coopers. Right? Is that like, are you about to say Allahu Akbar in the car? No. You made, that's mutlaqul azm, is the general determination, right? But shar'an, it has a much more, right? So, because there's these interrelated words, and we're not going to go into them, but if you were to put a little effort, you could leave, because there's azm, and there's jazm, and there's qasd, and there's niyyah, right? And what is stronger than which? But we don't want to go into that, but the most broad is azm, when you determine something. And so niyyah can be used in a broad sense in the Arabic language, when you decide yes to something. But the niyyah al-shar'iyyah is al-qasd al-mukhtarin bil-amal, is not just the determination. You say yes, but when you say yes, I'm doing it, connected حقيقة وحكما, really, which is مقارنة ببداية العمل, right when you're beginning the action or just before it. And how much before the action is okay depends on what the action is. You know, fasting you could have intended from Maghrib time. The prayer, we'll see, you could intend, the prayer counts even before the prayer, as long as nothing happened between the intention and the prayer that you could not have done in the prayer. So you intended to go pray Maghrib, you got a phone call from your friend. So you're just talking to your friend, you walk into the masjid, say, okay, they're about to pray, this, that. Okay. And the person's still talking. You're on one of these earphones, and they're still talking, but you couldn't hang up on them because they'll be offended. You said Allahu Akbar. You made the intention when you headed to the masjid, right? If you were talking, can you talk in the prayer? No. But there, you'd ask, before you said Allahu Akbar, was that intention in the heart? Yes. Dalil al-Zahir, naam. Because why are you facing the Qibla? Why are you standing in the line? All of this is dalil what? Of wujud al-qasd. That if we pause time, if we take a frame, okay, why do you say Allahu Akbar? The adamun niyyah would be, you have no clue why you said Allahu Akbar. Now, is it conceivable that someone would go to the masjid, stand in the line, face towards the Qibla, say Allahu Akbar, without intending to pray? No. Right? So that, don't cause waswasa for people. Right? Tell them the right way of doing things, but don't give them tashwish that, oh, if you don't do this, this, and this, your intention is not valid. Then, توقع الناس في الوساوس. You cause people waswasa. I have a friend, I knew whoever would be studying with him, he was Shafi'i. Shafi'is are a little more strict on this. People in the masjid, there's one person I counted. I actually broke my prayer till the guy finished saying his takbir. 11 times. Allah, And so you have to make it audible. It's Allah. You know, especially at Dhuhr time, it's quiet, serene, it's a hot day, so we've got the windows open. Allah. And the guy's right next to me. Allah. I just broke the prayer. So okay, I'm going to wait, let him finish. It's a big fitna, right? And that's not helping anyone in their deen, right? So one has to be careful that the subtleties that we learn, that's not how you convey it, right? So here al-irada al-jazima. Imam al-Tahtawi rahmatullahi ta'ala alayhi says, in the Arabic language, it's lughatan al-azm. Azm is the resolve. And resolve is general. Azm, wal-azm hiya al-iradatu al-jazima, is the will that is firm, right? Because there's maratib of khawatir, right? You have a thought, then you have consideration, then mail, then so you have khatir, taraddud, mail, and then you have azm. When you say yes, that's azm. And then when that azm, the azm is when your will decides on something, right? That's more general. And then from azm you have qasd, which is the azm when it gets connected to actually doing the action, right? So there's cake. You look at it, you get the thought, let me eat it. Then you incline. Then you taraddud, yes or no, diet or enjoyment. Right? So khatir, mail, khatir, taraddud, then mail, inclination. And you start justifying, I'll share it with Sidi Yaqub. That's mail. But then you say, yes, I'll have it. But let these people go away, then I'll have it. That's azm. In the language, azm is used for this as well. Now beyond azm, you have qasd. Qasd is when the azm, but I said, yes, I'm going to eat it. Nawayt an akul al-kak. But the qasd is when the azm yaqtarin bil-fi'l. So, okay, I'm eating it now, right? Like the intention, the azm connects with the action. That's called qasd. So ta'rif an-niyya, the definition of intention is given from qasd. And al-Tahtawi here quotes Sa'd ad-Din al-Taftazani, who we talked about recently, right? We did? You could find the story of Sa'd ad-Din al-Taftazani. It's there, right? Someone can find it. Please share it. Al-Taftazani, in his Talweeh, Sharh al-Tawdih, right? He gives this amazing definition. And some of you will be familiar with it if you're awake in previous texts that we covered, but this is where it's from. You can find it in Tahtawi. He says, وَفِي الشَّرْعِ قَصْدُ الطَّاعَةِ. So that we've seen there's difference between azm and qasd, right? In the levels of thoughts, right? With respect to something. وَفِي الشَّرْعِ قَصْدُ الطَّاعَةِ is the firm resolve or the determination, right, to do an act of obedience. وَالتَّقَرُّبِ إِلَى اللَّهِ, and to draw closer to Allah. فِي إِيجَادِ الْفِعْلِ أو فِي إِيجَادِ فِعْلٍ, in beginning the action. That's كما في التلويح, right? And this is really good. And similarly, so basically the intention has three parts. ماذا, لماذا, and متى. What, why, when. Right? So, and this definition is important, right? So, now underlying it, any ta'ah, underlying it, there's an assumption that taqarrub ila Allah is there. Because let's say that some random brother called Basir, right? You know Sidi Basir? Let's say there's some random person called Basir. He's feeling really lazy. He says, Allahu Akbar, right? All they had in mind is, Nawaitu Salah. And they didn't have in mind Lillahi Ta'ala or anything. Is it valid? They just had Maghrib, Allahu Akbar. There's no thought that it was Lillahi Ta'ala. Is it valid?
Yeah.
Why? Because if we paused, said, okay, ماذا تصلي المغرب؟ لماذا؟ لأنه واجب. لماذا يكون؟ فايش؟ So what? They'll be scared. لأنه واجب. Say, okay. سلمنا, it's واجب, but why are you doing it? لأني Muslim. So what? If you keep asking, it says, لأن الله أمر به. Allah commanded. So what? So underlying it is his niyatul imtithal. Why? There's underlying it, there's some meaning that this is for Allah. Allah has commanded it, He's deserving of it. It's for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But that is a very weak intention. If we submitted work like this, of course, but even you have to have a little bit of mercy in work, because if you really fired everyone who didn't do their work properly, you probably have to fire nearly all people, right? And that's a big problem, right? Fortune 500 companies, they say that after 6 months of anyone being on staff, managers are only pleased with less than 19% of their staff. If it was up to them, they'd get rid of the other 81%. But so rahmah is needed even in creation, right? But so it's inevitable, right? Because لماذا تطيع, right? So that's inevitable. But the proper thing is to pause and to consider two things. ماذا ولماذا. Of course, the waqt, you intend it before the time, but in anything you consider two things. This has to do الطاعة. What is طاعة? موافقة فعل العبد أمر الرب. Right? That's the definition of طاعة. يعني okay. And there's different موافقة يعني فعل العبد يعني أمر الرب. Right? الطاعة. Right? And this ولو أمر إباحة, even in permissible things. So this applies to prayer, applies outside too. That's why they say بالنيات تنقلب العادات عبادات. Through intentions, habits become acts of worship. You're drinking coffee. You're serving coffee. Why are you serving it? Because I have to. No. But you make an intention. What am I doing? I'm serving coffee to others. So this is, they refer to this purposeful action, right? إنما الأعمال بالنيات. You serve coffee. Now, is serving coffee without intention a good deed or not? It is, because if you ask, why did you serve it? Because felt bad drinking on an oath. Okay. But why did you do it? It's because it's a good thing to do. Why is it a good thing to do? Because my parents told me to do things like this. So why do you listen to them? Underlying it is some meaning lillahi ta'ala. But it's very deep, and even if you do it, there's not necessarily much concern for ihsan. But even these adat, you're going shopping. Why are you going shopping? Hik. Right? But to the extent that you can have purposefulness. What am I doing? ماذا ولماذا. Get everything. Right? So you do it. As the poet said, وَلَوْلَا هَوَاكُمْ فِي الْحَشَى مَا تَحَرَّكْنَا. And were not for yearning for you in our hearts, we would not move an inch. Right? It makes no sense to do anything in life unless there's a clear purpose. فاللهم لولا أنت ما اهتدينا وما تصدقنا ولا تصدقنا ولا صلينا فأنزلا سكينة علينا وثبت الأقدام إن لاقينا. يعني نحن العلا قد جاءوك مسلمين والمشركين قد بغوا علينا إذ أرادوا فتنة أبينا. Right? At the Battle of the Trench, when they're digging the trench. Right? Allahumma, oh Allah, were it not for you, we would not have been guided and would not have given in charity nor prayed, etc. Right? And that's a reality. That's intention. That's a beautiful definition. قصد الطاعة والتقرب إلى الله في إيجاد فعل. Here, if you look, of course, related to niyyah is the mabhath of ikhlas. Right? Is the discussion on ikhlas, sincerity. And the discussion on sincerity is covered beautifully, summarized beautifully, and the fiqh related to niyyah and ikhlas in the Hadiyah al-Ala'iyyah. Have we got both texts there? The Hadiyah al-Ala'iyyah and... Yeah, either way. But let's just share it wherever. Have I been given access to the Moodle there? Have I?
Yeah, your teacher.
I didn't get any notification though.
It hasn't been giving any of us yet.
You have to go on the Moodle page and then find the class and then you can access it.
Okay. But maybe we should email a link to everybody or even put it on the thing. So, do you know how to access it? Okay. But let's just share the link to the classroom because anyone who has a login, they can go in, right? But the discussion on ikhlas, two simple resources, right? The Hadiyah al-Ala'iyyah summarizes, and there's some beautiful things, especially about what's ikhlas and riya. And the other, in a summarized fashion, is it durar al-mubaha fi al-hadri wal-ibaha online? Omar. If it's, just check, because if it's not, somebody should scan it. Should maybe make someone pay expiation for missing classes and get them to scan it, or somebody, right? Anyways, ask Sidi Sufyan if he knows how to get it scanned. There's a story behind that I'm not going to tell. But Nahlawi, who's a Syrian scholar from early 20th century, wrote this beautiful Ad-Durar al-Mubaha في الحظر والإباحة in the Ahkam of Halal and Haram. It's really summarized largely from the Tariq al-Muhammadiyah. Has a beautiful discussion on ikhlas. Those two places, if someone wants to do us a favor and just take the pictures of those, that'd be really nice. Just keep it. You know, where ikhlas is mentioned in the Hadiyah al-Ala'iyyah, where ikhlas is mentioned, you find it in the indexes. And it's very useful. It helps to just keep it. So, you know, related to the lesson on conditions of prayer, we can look at the mabhath of ikhlas. So Imam Shumulai says, لِتَتَمَيَّزَ الْعِبَادَةُ عَنِ الْعَادَةِ, in order to distinguish an act of worship from a mere habit. Right? وَيَتَحَقَّقَ الْإِخْلَاص, and in order for sincerity to be realized. فِيهَا لِلَّهِ سُبْحَانَهُ وَتَعَالَى, in it for the sake of Allah Most High. Right? And Imam al-Tahtawi here has a nice summarized discussion on ikhlas, right? So he doesn't immediately give a definition of ikhlas, right? He says, وَالْإِخْلَاصُ سِرٌّ بَيْنَكَ وَبَيْنَ رَبِّكَ. Sincerity is a secret between you and your Lord. Right? As the poet said, لَقَدْ خَلَوْتُ مَعَ الْحَبِيبِ وَبَيْنَنَا سِرٌّ أَرَقُّ مِنَ النَّسِيمِ إِذَا سَرَى. I have been alone with the beloved, and between us is a secret, is a sir, is a subtle meaning. أَرَقُّ مِنَ النَّسِيمِ, more subtle than the gentle morning breeze when it flows. Right? He says, فَدُهِشْتُ, and the poet continues that you can find it in its place. Most of his poetry, if you Google it, you can find it online too. But people who put poetry on Facebook and stuff, find it from a reliable source online. Anyways, لا يطلع عليه ملك فيكتبه. Even the angels don't see your intentions. ولا شيطان فيفسده. the shaitan cannot see your intention to corrupt it, as some of the early Muslims said. وَلَا هَوَى فَيَمِيلَهُ. And caprice cannot take over the sincere intention. So caprice cannot turn away your sincere intent. Because what is ikhlas? Ikhlas is it's purely for Allah. So purity and ulterior motives don't come together. Right? ذكره الحموي. وذلك بأن تريده تعالى بطاعته. يعني and ikhlas is that you seek Allah through your act of obedience. ولا تريد سواه, and you don't seek any besides. وفي الخلاصة, and then there's some fiqh of it. You can see it there. And then he says, وَالتَّحْرِيمَ, and the opening takbir. So we'll stop at the tahrima. وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم. Any questions here?
What we took earlier, that if you intend to face the building of the Kaaba, then that would render.
So what's the question?
So does one require a sound niyyah of istiqbal or no?
What do you mean?
There seems to be a contrast.
A sound niyyah of istiqbal? No, I don't know.
You intend istiqbal,
No.
but if someone intends facing the Kaaba itself or the mihrab, for example, then we took that would render their prayer.
No, because one, it's a hypothetical issue. Because you have to be facing the qibla. If you have a false intent, so if you don't have, this only if you have a niyyah sariha. Because the dilalat al-hal is if you're facing the right direction, you're facing the right direction. But you say, no, I am not facing the qibla, I am facing the Kaaba. So you say, okay, what if we move the Kaaba? So I'll face over there. Right? If in Kitab al-Ridda, in the Durr al-Mukhtar with Hashid bin Adin mentions, if someone says, and of course, Kitab al-Ridda has all kinds of strange things that, especially the Hanafis, they wanted to just warn people, don't do silly things. So anything where there's anything harmful to say, kufr. So and there's some really cool things. They said it's kufr. Right? Said if someone says that تأتي الكعبة تزورني, the Kaaba comes and visits me, kafar. It's kufr. And they just did it like for regulation, right? Like public law. Like, you can't do wacky things. Like, in court, the qadi would say, don't you dare say that again. But it's a warning. We won't call someone and say, actually, it's possible. Right? It's possible for the, a karama. It's kharqul ada. Allah could do it. But if you make a weird claim, then we don't accept it unless there's clear proof, right? So it's a theoretical issue that if someone genuinely intended a wrong intention, but people don't, right? So don't give people bad ideas, right? And that's why, one of the mashayikh, if they taught things like this in a public desk, would either go through it really quickly and not highlight it at all, or really contextualize it. And they wouldn't entertain unnecessary thinking about that. So what do you do? So intention, what do you do? قصد الطاعة والتقرب إلى الله في إيجاد فعل. Not just in ibadah, but also in your adat. Always have purposefulness. Before you pick up a glass to drink, a glass of water to drink, I'm drinking this water, lillahi ta'ala. And I'm drinking this water, you think what it is, why? Wallahu khalaqakum wa ma ta'malun. Your actions are, it's all, قُلْ كُلٌّ مِّنْ عِنْدِ اللَّهِ. It facilitates tawheedic consciousness, right? And this helps gratitude. gives meaning to life, etc., right? A lot of the despair, because without purpose, life is desperate, right? And we mention it often, but it's worth listening to. Although I discourage you guys to necessarily to read in English, but you want to listen to something meaningful in English. Have you listened to it? This is Water? David Foster Wallace. David Foster Wallace, there's a website called Brain Pickings. So if you type Brain Pickings, David Foster Wallace, This is Water, it's like 20 minutes. It's one of the most influential commencement speeches ever, the text. But basically, if you don't have purpose, life is miserable. Going shopping is a scary act. That's why ghafla is of the greatest blessings of Allah. Most people don't think. If they thought, people would commit mass suicide if they didn't believe. If you pause and think, right? Right? Without the beloved, life is torture. Right? من فاته منك وصل حظه الندم. Right? 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 ومن تكن همه تسمو به الهمم. Right? Right?